History often carries stories of courage, innovation, and humanity's ability to progress. But hidden within its darker corners are events so disturbing, so inhumane, that they challenge our understanding of what it means to be human. This is not a tale of fiction. There are no imagined characters here. The events you are about to learn about truly happened, carried out not by monsters or mythical creatures, but by doctors, scientists, and military leaders. Human beings who deliberately crossed the boundary between research and barbarity. For decades, the truth remained buried under official documents, government silence, and the fog of war. The world was not meant to know what happened inside a secret military facility in occupied Manchuria during the 1930s and 1940s. The victims who suffered there had no graves, no memorials, and no justice. Their stories were almost erased from history. But silence, no matter how deep, cannot bury the truth forever. This is the story of Unit 731, a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit under the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II. On the surface, it was described as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, a center for public health. But behind its walls, far away from the eyes of the world, it became the site of some of the most horrific human experiments ever conducted. Unit 731 turned men, women, children, and even pregnant mothers into research material. The victims were referred to not as humans, but as maruta, a Japanese word meaning logs. They were stripped of identity, dignity, and life, all in the name of scientific advancement and military superiority. Inside those laboratories, science was not used to heal, but to destroy. This chapter of history is horrifying not only for the brutality that occurred, but for the chilling reality that it was conducted with organization, planning, and professional intelligence. It was cruelty disguised as research, where human beings were used as test subjects, treated as disposable material, and science was turned into horror. The story of Unit 731 is not merely about the past. It is a warning, a reminder of what happens when power, nationalism, and scientific ambition combine without morality. And today, we open the doors of that hidden facility, and we let the truth speak. To understand how Unit 731 came into existence, we must look at the world that shaped it. In the early 1930s, Japan was no longer satisfied with remaining a small island nation. Its leaders believed that true national strength could only be achieved through expansion and domination. After World War I, Japan began reshaping itself into an imperial military power, determined to control Asia and secure its place among the world's strongest nations. But Japan lacked the natural resources needed to fuel its growing industries and military ambitions. This need for resources led Japan to look outward, and soon its attention turned toward Manchuria, a region in northeastern China rich in coal, iron, and land. In 1931, Japan staged the Mukden incident to justify invading Manchuria, and the takeover was swift and forceful. The region was transformed into the Japanese-controlled puppet state of Manchukuo, and from the outside, it appeared to be a political expansion. But behind the scenes, Manchuria became something more. A remote and hidden territory where Japan could build secret military projects far away from international eyes. One of those projects would become Unit 731. However, military expansion alone does not explain the horrors that followed. A darker element was at play, a deliberate and systematic dehumanization of other Asian populations. During this period, Japanese military propaganda taught soldiers and citizens that Japan was racially superior, while Chinese, Korean, and other neighboring peoples were inferior, weak, and less human. This belief became a powerful tool. Once a population is seen as less than human, cruelty becomes easier to justify. Soldiers were trained to suppress empathy, to view mercy as weakness, and to obey without question. In this environment, the people of China were gradually stripped of identity and dignity. To many Japanese military personnel, they were no longer individuals with families, names, and lives. They became numbers, property, and eventually test material. This dehumanization laid the psychological foundation for the brutal experiments that would later take place in Unit 731. At the same time, the pressure of looming global conflict pushed Japan to pursue more advanced and unconventional forms of warfare. While many nations debated the morality of biological and chemical weapons, Japan saw them as an opportunity. The 1925 Geneva Protocol had banned such weapons in warfare, but to Japan's military strategists, this ban only proved how effective these weapons could be. Disease, they believed, could become a silent and devastating weapon, more effective than bullets or bombs. If a virus or bacteria could be controlled and directed, entire cities and armies could be destroyed without traditional combat. But to develop such weapons, scientists needed living human bodies to experiment on. The combination of imperial ambition, racist ideology, and the desperate desire for scientific and military advantage created the conditions that allowed Unit 731 to be born. In the occupied lands of Manchuria, far from the rest of the world and shielded by secrecy, Japan built a facility where science was twisted into something unrecognizable, where experimentation replaced ethics and human life became disposable. At the center of Unit 731 was a man whose ambition and ideology shaped one of the darkest chapters in medical history. His name was Shiro Ishii. Born in 1892 in Japan, Ishii was highly intelligent, academically gifted, and deeply ambitious from a young age. He studied medicine at Kyoto Imperial University, where he quickly gained attention for his sharp mind and bold, unconventional thinking. But alongside his intelligence was a troubling personality trait. He lacked empathy. Ishii viewed science not as a tool to heal, but as a means to control and conquer. To him, human beings were not sacred lives, but subjects through which progress could be measured. After graduating, Ishii joined the Japanese Imperial Army as a medical officer. He was fascinated not by surgery or treatment, but by the emerging field of biological warfare, the use of bacteria and viruses as weapons. Ishii believed that diseases could be engineered to destroy armies and entire populations silently. While other scientists debated whether such research was ethical or even possible, Ishii saw it as the future of warfare. He traveled widely across Europe and America, studying foreign research and observing quarantine systems, always searching for ways to use pathogens as weapons. The more he learned, the more he became convinced that biological warfare could make Japan unstoppable. But Ishii also understood something else. To develop a biological weapon, one must test it on living human bodies. Laboratory animals were not enough. They did not react the way humans did. To him, this was simply a scientific requirement, not a moral concern. He believed that the pursuit of advancement justified any means, no matter how cruel. Human suffering, in his eyes, was merely data. When Ishii returned to Japan with these ideas, he began lobbying military and government leaders. He argued that if Japan wanted to expand and dominate Asia, it needed weapons more powerful and terrifying than ordinary explosives. Traditional warfare, he claimed, was outdated. The future belonged to invisible enemies, viruses and bacteria that could wipe out cities without a single shot fired. At first, his proposals seemed extreme, even within the military, but Ishii was persuasive, strategic, and influential. He gained the support of powerful army generals, including Colonel Chikahiko Koizumi, who would later become Japan's health minister. By appealing to national pride and fear of foreign powers, he gradually convinced military leadership to embrace his vision. And once Japan seized Manchuria in 1931, Ishii finally saw his opportunity. The occupied territory was perfect, distant, isolated, and free from international oversight. It was there that he proposed the establishment of a research facility dedicated to biological experimentation. The military approved it, funding it under the harmless official name of the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. In reality, it was the beginning of Unit 731. Shiro Ishii believed he was advancing science and strengthening his nation. But in his pursuit of power and knowledge, he abandoned every trace of humanity. His belief that progress required human experimentation turned him into the architect of torture, disease, and death on a massive scale. And it was his leadership that opened the doors to the horrors that would soon unfold behind the walls of Unit 731. Hidden deep in the cold and isolated Pingfang district of Harbin in Manchuria, now a part of modern-day China, stood the facility that would become known as Unit 731. The location was chosen with careful intent. It was far from the eyes of the international community and distant enough that any rumors about strange activity could be dismissed as wartime propaganda. The local population, already subdued under Japanese occupation, had no means to challenge or even question what was being built. From the outside, the facility appeared to be a medical and epidemic prevention center. Yet behind its walls, it operated as a fully equipped research compound dedicated to human experimentation and biological warfare. The facility itself was massive. By 1936, it had expanded to include approximately 150 buildings and structures spreading across 6 square kilometers. It functioned like a self-contained world, built not only for research but for imprisonment and destruction. The complex employed roughly 3,000 staff members, including scientists, doctors, technicians, and military personnel. There were laboratories where scientists and military doctors conducted experiments with bacteria, viruses, and chemical substances. These labs were filled with equipment designed for controlled infection and biological cultivation. Every room was carefully planned to allow researchers to observe the progress of disease, sometimes over minutes, sometimes over weeks, as human subjects suffered and died. The facility maintained approximately 4,500 flea incubators, capable of producing at least 45 kilograms of plague-infected fleas per cycle, demonstrating the industrial scale of biological weapon production. But laboratories were only one part of the complex. There were also prison cells, underground and heavily secured, where the victims were kept. At its peak, Unit 731 had the capacity to detain up to 600 prisoners concurrently for experimental purposes. These prisoners were not treated as people. They were held in crowded, filthy conditions, deprived of sunlight, medical care, and basic human dignity. Many knew that once they entered these cells, they would never leave alive. When the time came for experimentation, they were moved to examination rooms, or, more disturbingly, to dissection rooms, where live surgeries and vivisections took place. These rooms were constructed like operating theaters, except there was no anesthesia, no pain relief, and no intention to save the patient. The goal was not healing, it was observation. The scientists wanted to study the human body as it reacted to disease, injury, and extreme conditions, and they believed that only a conscious, living subject could provide accurate results. At the edge of the facility stood cremation chimneys and massive furnaces, which were operated daily. They were used to burn the bodies of the victims after experiments were completed, leaving no trace of the people who had died there. Thousands were reduced to ash, their identities erased so thoroughly that even history nearly forgot them. The smoke that drifted into the cold Manchurian air carried the remains of countless lives, extinguished in silence. Security at Unit 731 was absolute. Armed guards patrolled every boundary, and they had orders to shoot anyone on site who approached without authorization. No questions, no warnings. Even those who worked inside were bound to secrecy. Anyone caught discussing the nature of the experiments faced severe punishment or death. Families of workers were often kept in Japan to ensure loyalty and silence. Every layer of the facility was built to ensure that the truth would never escape its walls. Unit 731 was not simply a building, it was a machine of death, designed to operate efficiently, silently, and without humanity. Its walls held the weight of suffering that the world would not learn about for decades. And yet, at the time, it functioned as though it were just another military installation, hidden in plain sight, fueled by ambition, cruelty, and the cold pursuit of scientific power. The victims of Unit 731 came from many walks of life, yet they shared one thing in common. They were all stripped of their identity, humanity and dignity the moment they entered the facility. The largest group of victims were Chinese civilians, taken from their homes, villages, workplaces, or simply off the streets of Manchuria. Some were accused of minor crimes, others were taken for no reason at all. Under Japanese occupation, their lives held no legal protection, and their disappearance went unrecorded. Entire families were separated. Men, women, the elderly, and even young children were imprisoned not because of what they had done, but because of who they were. Targets deemed expendable in Japan's pursuit of biological warfare. Among the prisoners were Korean and Russian captives as well. Korea, under Japanese control at the time, was seen as another population suitable for exploitation. Koreans, too, were labeled inferior and therefore useful only as bodies for experimentation. Russian prisoners, often captured during border conflicts in the region, were also transported to the facility. Some were soldiers, but many were civilians caught in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Over time, even captured Allied soldiers, including Americans, British, and Australians, found themselves inside the walls of Unit 731. Although few in number compared to Asian victims, their presence reveals how far the reach of the facility extended during wartime. No one was spared because of age, gender, or condition. Pregnant women were deliberately chosen for experimentation. The Japanese scientists wanted to observe how diseases developed in fetuses and how infections spread from mother to child. These women were forced into pregnancy, often by male prisoners who had been intentionally infected with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases. Babies were sometimes delivered only so they could be subjected to experimentation themselves, or to be studied before being killed. The brutality extended to children, infants, and the elderly. The facility made no distinction between young and old, strong and weak. Every body, no matter how fragile, was viewed as material for research. The victims were not referred to by name. They had no identity inside the walls of Unit 731. Instead, they were called maruta, a Japanese word meaning logs. This term was intentionally chosen to reinforce the belief that the prisoners were not human beings but mere objects, pieces of wood to be cut, burned, and disposed of without thought. The metaphor extended further. Just as lumber is used to fuel a machine, so too were these prisoners used to fuel experiments. Interestingly, the official cover story given to local authorities was that the facility was a lumber mill, making the term a dark inside joke among the staff. According to some accounts, the project was even internally called Holzklotz, from the German word for log. Calling them Maruta erased their humanity, their personal histories, their value as living people. It allowed the scientists and guards to perform unspeakable acts without guilt, because in their minds, they were not harming humans. They were handling material. Between 1940 and 1945, at least 10,000 to 14,000 people were killed inside the facility itself at Pingfang alone, with estimates suggesting at least 3,000 were subjected directly to human experimentation during that period. When including all branches and related units across China and Southeast Asia, the total number of victims rises dramatically. No documented survivors are known to have emerged from Unit 731's experiments. The victims of Unit 731 had no gravestones, no chance to speak, and no final plea for mercy. Their suffering was hidden behind sealed gates and guarded silence. Their lives were taken in the service of cruelty disguised as science. Yet, despite every attempt to erase them, their memory survives, not through names recorded in documents, but through the truth that refused to remain buried inside Unit 731. The idea of medical science was twisted into something unrecognizable. The facility did not seek to cure disease, improve health, or advance human well-being. Instead, its experiments were designed to study how the human body breaks down under suffering, infection, injury, and death. Every experiment was conducted without anesthesia, without mercy, and without any intention of saving the victim. The prisoners were not seen as patients, but as living test specimens whose only purpose was to provide data. The researchers believed that the knowledge gained from these experiments would help Japan create new biological and chemical weapons, making the nation more powerful in war. But in the process, science was stripped of morality and humanity was abandoned entirely. Perhaps the most disturbing of all the practices in Unit 731 was vivisection, the act of performing surgery on a living human being without anesthesia or pain relief. Victims were infected with diseases such as plague, typhoid, tuberculosis, cholera, anthrax, or dysentery, and then observed as their symptoms progressed. Once the infection reached a certain stage, the prisoner would be taken to a dissection room. There, doctors opened the body while the victim was still fully conscious. No anesthesia was used because the scientists believed that numbing drugs might affect organ function or contaminate the purity of the data they were trying to collect. Some sources indicate that to stifle the victim's screaming, researchers would stuff rags or medical gauze into their mouths before beginning the procedure. The purpose was to examine exactly how the disease affected internal organs in real time. Organs such as the liver, lungs, heart, kidneys, and intestines were removed for study while the victims were alive. Researchers observed how fluid built up in tissue, how disease spread from one organ to another, and how long the body could remain alive after certain parts were removed. Many victims died slowly and painfully during these procedures. The scientists took notes, sketched anatomical diagrams, and discussed their findings as though they were observing a laboratory sample rather than a human life. To them, this was not cruelty. It was science. To the victims, it was torture beyond comprehension. Former Unit 731 member Okawa Fukumatsu later admitted in a video interview to having vivisected a pregnant woman. Imperial Japanese Army surgeon Ken Yuasa testified that vivisection was widespread even outside Unit 731, estimating that at least 1,000 Japanese personnel were involved in the practice across mainland China, and that such practices were routine among Japanese doctors stationed there during the war. One anonymous former medical assistant recounted his first experience of vivisecting a plague-infected victim. The fellow knew that it was over for him, and so he didn't struggle when they led him into the room and tied him down. But when I picked up the scalpel, that's when he began screaming. I cut him open from the chest to the stomach, and he screamed terribly, and his face was all twisted in agony. He made this unimaginable sound. He was screaming so horribly, but then finally he stopped. This was all in a day's work for the surgeons, but it really left an impression on me because it was my first time. Because the Japanese military believed they would fight in extremely cold regions, Unit 731 conducted extensive experiments to understand how the human body reacts to freezing temperatures. A physiologist named Yoshimura Hisato had a special interest in hypothermia and routinely used human subjects to test reactions to frostbite. Prisoners were taken outside during the harsh Manchurian winter and had their arms, legs, or hands exposed to ice and snow until the flesh froze solid. Sometimes, cold air was blown directly onto the skin to accelerate the process. Yoshimura would submerge prisoners' limbs in tubs filled with ice water and hold them there until a coat of ice formed over the skin. He carefully timed how long it took for human bodies to develop frostbite. The researchers would tap the frozen limb to see whether it made a sound like a plank of wood when struck with a cane, signaling that the tissue had completely frozen. Once the limb was frozen, various methods were tested to thaw it: dousing with hot water, exposure to open fire, rubbing, or simply leaving the subject untreated overnight to see how long it took for the prisoner's blood to thaw it out naturally. Unit 731 was able to prove scientifically that the best treatment for frostbite was to immerse it in water slightly warmer than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but never more than 122 degrees. In many cases, however, the frozen limbs would turn black, rot, or become severely infected. When that happened, the affected body parts were amputated, again without anesthesia, and studied for signs of internal damage. Some prisoners had their limbs amputated and then surgically reattached to the opposite side of their bodies. Others had their limbs crushed intentionally, or had their blood circulation cut off to study gangrene. Some victims died from shock or infection. Others were kept alive for repeated experiments. The frostbite experiments were not conducted to save lives, but to determine the fastest way to treat Japanese soldiers so they could return to the battlefield. The human suffering involved was considered irrelevant. Unit 731 was perhaps most infamous for its experiments involving infectious diseases. Scientists cultivated and bred bacteria such as plague, anthrax, cholera, typhoid, paratyphoid, dysentery, tuberculosis, and glanders inside the laboratories. By 1939, Shiro Ishii had condensed his research to 6 potent pathogens that were robust enough to ignite epidemics of considerable magnitude and resilient to aerial dispersal. Japanese soldiers later provided testimony indicating that the research program had the capability to manufacture substantial quantities of biological agents on a monthly basis. 300 kilograms of plague bacteria, 500 to 700 kilograms of anthrax, 800 to 900 kilograms of typhoid, and 1,000 kilograms of cholera. These pathogens were then deliberately introduced into human subjects through various methods. Sometimes, victims were injected with the bacteria through syringes. In other cases, their food, water, or even open wounds were contaminated to test how infection could spread under different conditions. Prisoners were given disguised vaccinations that were actually disease injections. Large glass chambers were also used to release bacteria into the air, to determine whether airborne infection could be weaponized for a battlefield deployment. Once infected, prisoners were monitored closely around the clock. Researchers recorded how long symptoms took to appear, how quickly fever rose, how the body reacted to pain, and how the organs began to fail. Comprehensive clinical records, each more than 100 pages long, documented the daily progression of various pathogens within the bodies of helpless prisoners. No treatment was provided, because the purpose was not to cure the disease, but to watch the victim die from it and then perform autopsies to examine the internal effects of the infection. These experiments were used to design biological weapons that could be dropped on enemy cities, with the goal of causing mass death without direct military confrontation. Food items emerged as a preferred delivery mechanism for bacterial transmission. In one specific experiment, typhoid was introduced into melons and cantaloupes. Following contamination, the bacterial density was measured, and once it reached the desired level, the infected fruit was distributed to a small group of prisoners with the objective of spreading typhoid throughout the entire group. Entire villages in China were later infected using this research, leading to widespread outbreaks and countless deaths far beyond the walls of the facility itself. Among the most disturbing experiments were those involving pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases. Unit 731. Researchers wanted to understand how infections like syphilis and gonorrhea spread between sexual partners and from mother to unborn child. To do this, male prisoners were deliberately infected with syphilis and then ordered to rape female prisoners under military supervision. When the women became infected, scientists tracked how the disease progressed through their bodies. More rapes were systematically arranged until exposure established infection. Pregnant women were given no care or comfort. Instead, they were used to study reproductive biology and the effects of disease on fetal development. As the pregnancy advanced, the women were taken to the dissection rooms where their bodies were opened while they were still alive. Researchers examined the fetus and placenta, noting how infection had developed inside the womb and affected the unborn child. The babies were sometimes removed alive but were not allowed to survive. They too became subjects of experimentation or were killed immediately for anatomical study. Pregnant women infected with syphilis were of special interest to the researchers. These experiments were conducted under the belief that scientific progress required real-time observation, and that the suffering of the victims did not matter. The brutality of Unit 731 did not end with disease and dissection. The facility also served as a testing ground for conventional weapons and chemical agents. Prisoners were tied to stakes in open fields at various distances, while grenades were thrown nearby, so researchers could measure the effects of shrapnel on the human body at different ranges. Flamethrowers were tested on living subjects to determine how far fire could spread across skin and muscle, and whether protective coverings made any difference. Poisonous gases, including mustard gas, phosgene, and other chemical agents, were released into sealed rooms containing victims who struggled and eventually suffocated as scientists observed their reactions from behind protective glass windows. Unit 731 also studied the effects of various weapons, including bayonets, swords, and knives on human flesh. Pressure chambers were used extensively to study the effects of extreme atmospheric change. Victims were placed inside sealed metal chambers where the air pressure was gradually increased or decreased to simulate different altitudes or underwater conditions. Some died from ruptured organs and internal hemorrhaging. Others lost consciousness as their bodies failed under the strain. Researchers studied how long humans could survive at different pressure levels. Similarly, human subjects were loaded into large centrifuges and spun at higher and higher speeds until they lost consciousness or died, which usually happened between 10 and 15 g-forces, in order to study the effects of high gravitational forces on pilots and falling paratroopers. Prolonged X-ray exposure was also tested, which sterilized and killed thousands of testing subjects. There were human subjects locked up and deliberately deprived of food and water to learn how long humans could survive without sustenance. In order to study crash injuries and trauma, heavy objects were dropped onto bound prisoners from varying heights. Each death, each injury, each moment of suffering was recorded, measured, and analyzed, not to save lives, but to understand how to use such techniques as weapons against enemies. Some experiments, as one Osaka University professor who witnessed footage later testified, had nothing to do with advancing the capability of germ warfare or of medicine. They were conducted out of what he called professional curiosity and playfulness. The experiments of Unit 731 were not accidents, nor were they the acts of a few individuals acting without orders. They were systematic, organized, and conducted under the authority of the Imperial Japanese Army with approval from the highest levels of military command. The suffering was not hidden from the researchers. They witnessed it every day, but they had already convinced themselves that the victims were not human. In their pursuit of power and scientific advancement, empathy was removed, morality discarded, and life reduced to data. What happened inside Unit 731 stands as one of the darkest examples of what can occur when science is separated from humanity. The experiments conducted inside Unit 731 were not limited to laboratory walls. The ultimate objective of the program was to transform biological knowledge into operational weapons, capable of wiping out entire populations without the need for traditional combat. Once the researchers believed they had gathered enough data from human experimentation, they moved to a far more devastating stage: field testing on civilian populations. These operations took place across occupied regions of China, targeting towns and villages filled with ordinary people who had no idea what was unfolding around them. At least 12 large-scale bioweapon field trials were carried out, and at least 11 Chinese cities were attacked with biological agents between 1940 and 1943. During this period, Japanese scientists found that using bacterial bombs for direct transmission was not always effective, but they did find success in utilizing planes to spray microorganisms as a means of biological warfare delivery. One of the most infamous methods used was the deployment of plague-infected fleas. Scientists bred millions of fleas carrying the bubonic plague inside the laboratories of Unit 731 and Unit 1644, another biological warfare detachment. With approximately 4,500 flea incubators operating at full capacity, Unit 731 could produce massive quantities of infected vectors. Once enough fleas were produced, they were placed into specially designed ceramic bombs made of porcelain, an idea proposed by Ishii in 1938. These bombs were dropped from low-flying aircraft over Chinese cities, including the coastal city of Ningbo in 1940 and Changde in Hunan province in 1941. When the bombs burst open mid-air or upon impact, the fleas scattered across the land, attaching themselves to animals and people. Villagers soon began experiencing fever, painful swelling of lymph nodes, internal bleeding, and eventually fatal infections. Entire communities fell ill within days. The plague spread quickly through densely populated areas, and without medical infrastructure or knowledge of what had caused the outbreak, thousands of people died in agony. An attack on Changde in 1941 reportedly led to approximately 10,000 biological casualties and 1,700 deaths among ill-prepared Japanese troops themselves, mostly due to cholera infection, a stark reminder that biological weapons are difficult to control. Due to pressure from numerous accounts of these biowarfare attacks, Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek sent a delegation of army and foreign medical personnel in November 1941 to document evidence and treat the afflicted. A report on the Japanese use of plague-infected fleas on Changde was made widely available the following year, but it was not addressed by the Allied powers until President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued a public warning in 1943 condemning the attacks. Another method of biological warfare involved systematically contaminating wells, rivers, and food supplies. Researchers intentionally infected water sources with cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and paratyphoid germs in cities like Nanjing, then allowed local villagers to drink, cook, and bathe in the contaminated water. Food was also poisoned, sometimes placed in storage areas, distributed in markets, or delivered under the guise of humanitarian aid. In some regions, clothing donated to civilians was deliberately laced with infectious bacteria or anthrax spores. The resulting outbreaks were devastating. People became sick rapidly, and the diseases spread beyond the original targets, affecting neighboring areas and creating uncontrollable epidemics. Expeditions to Nanjing involved spreading typhoid and paratyphoid germs into wells, marshes, and houses, as well as infusing them in snacks distributed to locals. Epidemics broke out shortly after, to the elation of many researchers, who concluded that paratyphoid fever was the most effective of the pathogens for field deployment. The scale of death caused by Unit 731's biological attacks is difficult to measure precisely, but historians estimate that at least 200,000 to 300,000 civilians may have died as a direct result of biological warfare operations. Some estimates place the total death toll even higher when accounting for secondary spread and long-term epidemiological effects. Some outbreaks continued long after the war ended, as bacteria survived in water systems, soil, and animal populations. These attacks did not distinguish between soldiers and civilians, adults and children, the healthy and the vulnerable. The victims were farmers, mothers, elders, and families simply trying to live their lives. For the military strategists overseeing the operations, the deaths were considered field data to be analyzed and recorded on maps and in charts. But for the people who suffered, they were unimaginable tragedies, losses that could not be justified by any scientific or strategic reasoning. What makes this chapter particularly haunting is the cold calculation behind it. These attacks were not chaotic or emotional acts of violence. They were planned, measured, documented, and analyzed with clinical detachment. Plague outbreaks were tracked on detailed maps. The spread of infection was recorded in comprehensive charts and graphs. Reports were written summarizing how effective each operation had been, noting which pathogens spread most efficiently and which delivery methods produced the highest casualty rates. This level of organization reveals a disturbing truth. The destruction was not only intentional, it was seen as scientifically necessary. In December 1944, the Japanese Navy even explored the possibility of attacking cities on the west coast of the United States with biological weapons, in a plan known as Operation PX or Operation Cherry Blossoms at night. The plan involved Seirin aircraft launched by Sentoku submarine aircraft carriers targeting San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco with weaponized bubonic plague, cholera, typhus, and dengue fever. The operation was scheduled for September 1945, but was never carried out due to Japan's surrender. The field testing of biological warfare conducted by Unit 731 remains one of the most chilling examples of science being weaponized against humanity. It shows how knowledge, when divorced from compassion and ethical constraints, can become more dangerous than any weapon made of steel or fire. By 1945, the tide of World War II had turned decisively against Japan. Cities were being destroyed by Allied air raids, resources were exhausted, and the once confident Imperial Army was collapsing on nearly every front. As defeat became inevitable, those operating Unit 731 faced a terrifying realization. If the world discovered what they had done, the consequences would be severe. The experiments, the field tests, the mass suffering, none of it could be allowed to come to light. The Japanese leadership and the scientists of Unit 731 understood that history would judge them not as patriots or scientists, but as perpetrators of unspeakable crimes against humanity. In the final months of the war, as Soviet forces advanced into Manchuria in August 1945, orders were given to erase every trace of the program. The facility in Harbin was filled with thousands of documents, laboratory samples, medical records, bacterial cultures, and experimental instruments, all of which could expose the truth. Researchers dumped chemical agents into furnaces, burned mountains of paperwork, and destroyed entire storage rooms filled with evidence. Buildings were systematically demolished and rigged with explosives. The goal was simple: leave nothing behind that could reveal what had occurred inside those walls. But the destruction of records was not the only step taken. The prisoners, men, women, and children who had somehow survived earlier experiments and were still being held in the facility, were considered living evidence as well. To prevent their testimonies from ever being heard, they were systematically executed. Some were killed by lethal injections of potassium cyanide or chloroform, others by gunfire. In some cases, entire prison cells were burned or destroyed with explosives, with the victims still inside. These final killings were carried out not for scientific study, but purely to silence the last living witnesses who could testify to what had happened. As the Soviet army approached Harbin, the staff of Unit 731 abandoned the facility and fled back to Japan. The complex was blown up to destroy any remaining evidence. Many staff members expected to be arrested, tried, and punished for war crimes, similar to what was happening to Nazi officials in Europe. But what happened next is one of the most disturbing turns in the entire story. The program's leader, General Shiro Ishii, went into hiding shortly before Japan's surrender. After weeks of intelligence gathering, US officials located Ishii and several of his senior staff members, including his successor, Masaji Kitano. American investigators soon realized that the research conducted in Unit 731 was militarily valuable, particularly as the United States was now entering the early stages of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And biological warfare was seen as a potential strategic advantage. The data gathered from human experimentation at Unit 731 was unique precisely because it relied on procedures that no ethical research institution would ever conduct again. The Japanese scientists had tested plague, anthrax, cholera, frostbite, pressure trauma, and chemical burns directly on live human bodies under controlled conditions, creating a body of knowledge that could not be replicated. The United States made a calculated decision. Information was more valuable than justice. Instead of trying Ishii and his colleagues for war crimes at an international tribunal, like the one being held in Nuremberg for Nazi war criminals, American officials under General Douglas MacArthur's command negotiated a secret deal. In exchange for turning over all their research data and agreeing to full cooperation with US biological warfare programs, Unit 731 scientists would receive complete immunity from prosecution. Their crimes would not be publicly acknowledged. Their names would not appear in war crime indictments. Their experiments would be classified as valuable military research. And so, The men responsible for some of the worst human atrocities of the 20th century walked free. No trials, no accountability, no public recognition of their crimes. Shiro Ishii lived out the rest of his life quietly in Japan, dying of throat cancer in 1959 at the age of 67, never having faced justice. Some former Unit 731 doctors took prestigious positions in universities, hospitals, the pharmaceutical industry, and public health institutions. They were respected in society, honored in their professions, without the public knowing what they had done. The US government went further. They paid stipends to former Unit 731 personnel and concealed the unit's crimes from international tribunals. When the Soviet Union captured 12 Unit 731 members and put them on trial at the 1949 Khabarovsk war crimes trials, the United States dismissed the proceedings as communist propaganda and refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the evidence presented. The 12 defendants were convicted and sentenced to prison terms, but the United States and its allies showed no interest in pursuing further prosecutions. No apology was issued. No accountability was enforced. The victims were left without recognition, justice, or even proper graves. The US cover-up ensured that scientific knowledge was valued above human life. It revealed that even after the war had ended, political expediency and military advantage continued to shape decisions about morality and justice. Ironically, later evaluations found that the data acquired from Unit 731 offered little practical scientific value. The suffering had produced information that was largely useless for legitimate medical or military purposes. The truth of Unit 731 remained hidden and classified for decades, buried under secret files, protected by government silence, and dismissed in official histories, proving that history's darkest crimes are not always judged. Sometimes they are quietly absorbed, protected, and used. The legacy of Unit 731 is not confined to history books or academic research. It lives on in memories carried by families, whispered stories from survivors, and the scars left on entire communities across China, Korea, and Russia. For decades after the war, many of the victims' stories were silenced, not only because evidence had been destroyed, but because the world powers responsible for pursuing justice made the choice to hide the truth. Yet memory has a way of resurfacing, especially when generations later begin asking questions about the past that was never explained. In the regions where Unit 731 once operated, families still recall the sudden outbreaks of plague, cholera, and mysterious sicknesses that consumed their villages in the 1940s. Grandparents told their children about days when livestock died without explanation, wells turned dangerous, and neighbors collapsed in the streets. These stories were often spoken quietly, as if remembering could summon the horror back again. Survivors, those who had escaped biological attacks or lost loved ones to the epidemics, struggled with trauma that was rarely recognized publicly. Many could not prove what had happened to their families because the documents were gone, the perpetrators were protected, and the world refused to acknowledge the truth. But the suffering remained, passed down through memory, grief, and collective trauma. Today, one of the most significant places dedicated to preserving the truth is the Museum of Evidence of War Crimes by Japanese Army Unit 731, located in Harbin, China, standing on the very ground where the experiments took place. Open to the public and expanded over the years, the museum does not dramatize or sensationalize the past. Instead, it presents the evidence with calm, sober clarity. Visitors walk through the remains of prison cells, laboratories, dissection rooms, and the enormous cremation furnaces used to dispose of bodies. They can see the ruins of the boiler building, photographs of victims, preserved medical instruments, and testimonies from the few who survived to tell their stories. The silence inside these walls is heavy. People who enter often speak of a feeling that cannot be expressed in words, a recognition of suffering that goes beyond what can be fully understood. These memorials exist not to reopen wounds, but to ensure that the world never forgets what was done in the name of science and war. In recent years, more evidence has come to light. In 2025, previously classified Japanese military documents were released, providing further confirmation of the biological warfare program's scope and organization. Researchers continue to uncover personnel rosters, operational records, and testimonies from former staff members. On August 13th, 2024, Hideo Shimizu, a former member of Unit 731 who joined as a 14-year-old boy, publicly apologized before a memorial monument in China. Now in his 90s, Shimizu has spent decades speaking the truth about what he witnessed, despite facing harassment and denial from those in Japan who refuse to accept the historical record. Yet, remembrance has not been universal. In Japan, the legacy of Unit 731 remains a source of deep controversy and political tension. Some historians, educators, and citizens acknowledge the truth openly, calling for official apology and accountability. They believe that healing can only begin when wrongdoing is admitted and victims are honored. But others deny or minimize what occurred, claiming that the reports are exaggerated, fabricated, or motivated by anti-Japanese sentiment. Textbooks in Japan often discuss World War II without mentioning Unit 731 at all, or only briefly and vaguely. This erasure creates a painful divide, not only between nations but even within Japan itself. There are people in Japan who want to confront the past honestly, and others who fear that doing so would stain national identity or dishonor the memory of those who served in the military. The silence, the denial, and the lack of formal government apology continue to affect diplomatic and emotional relationships across East Asia. However, there has been some progress. On August 28th, 2002, the Tokyo District Court formally acknowledged that Japan had conducted biological warfare in China and held the Japanese state responsible for related deaths. While the court did not award damages to the plaintiffs, the ruling represented a significant official recognition of the crimes. The ethical implications of Unit 731 reach far beyond wartime history. They remind us of a fundamental truth. Science is not inherently good or bad. It becomes what human beings choose to make of it. The researchers in Unit 731 were not uneducated or mindless criminals. They were doctors, professors, and highly trained scientists. They did not commit atrocities because they were ignorant. They committed them because they believed that progress was more important than human life, that national security justified any means, and that certain people were less human than others. In their pursuit of knowledge, they separate science from morality. And once compassion is removed, once ethical boundaries are crossed, science can become something terrifying and monstrous. This is why the story of Unit 731 must continue to be told. It forces us to confront a difficult question that remains relevant today. What happens when human beings stop seeing each other as human? The moment a person becomes a number, a specimen, a tool, a statistic, or a resource, empathy disappears, and cruelty becomes not only possible, but systematic. The legacy of Unit 731 is a warning to every generation that follows about the dangers of unchecked power, scientific hubris, dehumanization, and moral compromise. In the end, the truth that emerges from this history can be summarized in a single message. Science without humanity becomes horror. Knowledge must always be guided by ethics. Power must always be balanced with responsibility. Ambition must always be tempered with compassion. And memory must never be erased for the sake of convenience, politics, or national pride. If the story of Unit 731 remains alive in our minds, then the suffering of its victims was not entirely in vain. Their memory becomes a shield, one that reminds the world to guard its compassion, its morality, and its humanity against the forces that would erode them. Because forgetting is the first step toward repeating. As we close this chapter of history, we are left with a silence that feels heavy, because it is filled with voices that were never allowed to speak. The men, women, children, and families who suffered inside Unit 731 did not leave behind letters, monuments, or farewell words. Their lives were taken, their identities erased, and their pain hidden for decades. But today, by remembering them, by speaking their story, we give back what was stolen. The acknowledgement that they lived, that they suffered, and that their stories matter. This history is not meant to shock for the sake of shock, nor to accuse for the sake of blame. It is meant to remind us of something deeply human, that our compassion is fragile and must be protected. The scientists and soldiers of Unit 731 were not born as monsters. They became capable of cruelty because they allowed ideology to replace empathy, ambition to replace conscience, nationalism to replace universal human dignity, and obedience to replace moral reasoning. And that is why we remember. We remember so that no nation, no institution, and no human being ever again believes that progress is worth more than life. We remember so that the mistakes of the past do not become the tragedies of our future. We remember so that those who suffered in silence are silent no longer. The world can only move forward when the truth is faced. Not forgotten, not denied, not buried under political convenience. May memory bring understanding. May understanding bring responsibility. And may responsibility prevent this from ever happening again. History's darkness teaches us invaluable lessons. But if mysteries and the unexplained keep you awake at night, I have another chilling story waiting for you. The cursed tale of the anguished man painting. Click the video appearing on your screen now to uncover its dark secrets. Stay curious. Stay human.